Hi there, it's Reading Adam. I'm back with you, and if you've never seen a video of mine before, I recommend that you watch this at 1.25 or 1.5 speed because I think as I talk most of the time, and well, I'd like to think that I think while I talk to have better words to choose. So, um, but since I do occasionally pause and have to think about stuff, speed up the pace because who wants to hear somebody talk slowly, right? I'm talking slowly because I kind of have to, but you don't have to listen slowly. So therefore, we're going to get started here. Today's video is about something I briefly touched on in a past video that I haven't uploaded as of yet, which I just glossed over a huge variety of books I read in the last year. Two books are both histories, and I like history, but I don't read. It's actually it's not the main thing that I read. I think most of my reading is literature, but um, I do occasionally read history, and I'd like to read more history, and I would read more history if I could find more books like this, Lincoln's Melancholy. Really awesome book by Joshua Wolf Shank and or Schenk, however you say his name. Anyway, highly recommend reading this book. Well worth your time. What I don't want to read more of are books like this, American Lion by John Meacham. This book I would never want to read again, and I wish I had never read it in the first place because it was awful. And I'm going to get into why it was awful. What I think makes just to kind of try to spell out a little more clearly than when I tried explaining this before. But these two books side by side, these two books, one is great, one is very mediocre. What makes them that way? And I wanted to read to you random paragraphs that I chose. I have them marked down in a note here, but I wanted to read some random paragraphs of what I think makes good history writing and bad history writing, and dive into this just a little bit so that you and I together can both find better books to read. Now, before I go into this, because I have some time here, I feel like speaking, I want to rush into things, and that's because I'm not very seasoned at this yet. I want to jump ahead of myself and get straight to the point, but I've got to learn to slow down and take things a bit slower. So when I read a book that's called How to Read a Book, and I think Adler Mortimer was there were two authors of the book. Adler Mortimer, I believe, was the name of one of them. And in How to Read a Book, there are different ways to read a book, and one of the ways is to what he calls pigeonholing a book. Now, pigeonholing is where you look at the front cover, you read some of the blurbs about the book, you look at the back cover, and you kind of get an idea, okay, well, this is what it's about. You might read the full introduction, you might read the conclusion, you might read paragraphs within the book itself. Before, I used to never think about that, but then as I was going through these two books, I started being like, well, I want to actually show readers or people who are watching this, I want to actually kind of read to them a few paragraphs and let them know, like, I'm not just making this up. Like, this is how one book reads, and this is how the other book reads. And when you pigeonhole a book, when you're trying to find a new book to read, and you don't know if it's going to be good or not, yes, the title and the cover might sound really good. Like, look at this. The title, American Lion. The cover, it's like a painting of Andrew Jackson. You might recognize the author's name. It says New York Times bestseller on it. It's got a Pulitzer Prize, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Really? Seriously? Well, that makes me just not respect the Pulitzer Prize. And then, there's quite a good amount of description on the back. There's lots of blurbs, self-blurbs. There's photos within the book. It looks like a good, solid history book. It's a biography. This one, interesting choice of photo by Lincoln. The title catches me. And this is also New York Times Book Review of the Year. Now that I can actually believe. Also has some interesting blurbs on the back. Says it's featured on the History Channel documentary Lincoln. And now this is not a New York Times bestseller. But as you pigeonhole the book, as you're trying to fit it into, you're just trying to get a snapshot of it to see if it's going to be worth reading, you're going through you have to read some of the paragraphs. You might have to read the full introduction. You might have to take like 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to figure it out. And you just, or even just the prelude or the preface you might read, not maybe the introduction. So that's kind of how you pigeonhole a book. That's how you find out if it's worth reading or not. Now, let me get into the meat of this video. So first I'm going to read a passage by, I'm going to read the American Lion passages, all right? There's just a few paragraphs. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's not going to take a lot of time. But I just want you to get an idea of what I mean by this book. And I didn't purposely choose like the worst passages or anything because I wasn't going to take that much time. I just flipped through at random and just chose random passages. And so I just marked them down because I didn't want to waste video time re-looking up random passages. So I'm going to pull them up here. So page 124, I'm going to read to you the first paragraph of this book, American Lion. Ever resilient, President Jackson rallied from his sickbed on Sunday, January 10th, 1830, to host a White House levee, I believe. The cabinet was there, and crowds of others from 5 in the afternoon until nearly 10 that night. Guests came and went, and Jackson stood with Emily and Mary, the picture of hospitality. One observer watched them approvingly, and I quote, "Shaking hands with those who had just entered the room or were about to retire from it, Mrs. Donaldson and Miss Easton of the president's family were dressed in American calico and wore no ruffles and no ornaments of any sort." Parenthesis. Emily's descendant Pauline Wilcox Burke wrote that the calico serves to show their loyalty to the Jackson Party. In 1828, Old Hickory's partisans had worn it as a sign of support for their candidate. Mrs. Burke added, "No doubt," and I quote, "no doubt Emily's concession to this whim of fashion was at a personal sacrifice, for her choice in dress leaned rather to velvets, brocades, and rich satins." Seriously? All right. Next one. Seriously, though, like, that's... Here, I'll give you another one. Did you find that interesting? I didn't find that interesting. All right. In this one, I marked down, I'm going to read 2 paragraphs, and I'm going to show how they connected them, how Mia Cham connected these. First paragraph. Signaling that she understood the political climate in which the social maneuvers were taking place, Mrs. Smith added, quote, "The bank question has been another point of controversy, so much so, a member of Congress told a friend of ours he should not be surprised at another blow-up. It had, after all, happened before." That's after the quote. Next quote. "Mrs. Eaton's affair at the beginning was but a spark, but what a conflagration it did cause." End quote. Next paragraph. "Mrs. Smith had personal reasons to look forward to a bonfire. She had hopes that Jackson would be bound for Tennessee after the election. Meanwhile, she liked the look of the new season. Chattering away in a letter, she said she and her husband had, quote, several new neighbors. How we shall like them, time must determine. An empress, an ex-minister's widow, and Mrs. Secretary McLean are among those nearest to us. Madame Iturbide, the former Empress of Mexico, is close to us. We could, were we so inclined, almost shake hands from our back windows. End quote. That's the end of that paragraph. So some things to note. First off, oh, that was boring. Secondly, he has this way of inserting quotes into like almost literally every paragraph. And that doesn't make it interesting. I don't care about a blurb comment from one person about okay, so he had here Mrs. Eden's affair at the beginning was but a spark, but what a conflagration it did cause. Then he uses a sentence to tie that in for some stupid reason. He says, Mrs. Smith had personal reasons to look forward to a bonfire. Okay, just referencing the conflagration and so forth. Just seemed unnecessary. Meanwhile, she liked the look of the new season. Unnecessary sentence. I don't see, like, the flow is really bad, I find, in this book. The flow is bad. And then you have random quotes like the one about people who live near Mrs. Smith. And as you go through, if you look at some of the other things about this, it doesn't all make a whole ton of sense. That's how this whole book reads, is you read that paragraph, all right, it made kind of sense. Will it make more sense as I continue to read? No. And then as you continue to read, it doesn't make very much more sense. And then, worst of all, it's all very forgettable. Very forgettable. Okay. This is on page 273, last 3 paragraphs after the space. And I'm not trying to torture you. I'm trying to read. This is, in my opinion, bad history writing, and then I will read what in my opinion, is good history writing. So, reading now. On Friday, December 3rd, 1833, Andrew Donaldson took Jackson's annual message to the Congress. Andrew Donaldson is Jackson's nephew. Andrew Jackson's nephew. The deposits had been removed. Jackson said because of, and I quote, the unquestionable proof that the Bank of the United States was converted into a permanent electioneering engine, end quote. The issue was, quote, whether the people of the United States are to govern through representatives chosen by their unbiased suffrages, or whether the money and power of a great corruption are to be secretly exerted to influence their judgment and control their decisions, end quote. But the bank was not going to make it easy. On Saturday, December 4th, 1833, Donaldson briefed Emily's brother Stockley. Quote, violent opposition may be expected from the friends of the bank and those that will combine with them for the purpose of counteracting the influence of the president, end quote. Henry Clay, fresh from Lexington, was prepared to take up the struggle on Beidel's behalf, and also his own. Donaldson was right. Jackson's foes were anxious not only to reverse by whatever means the removal of the deposits, but also longed to destroy Jackson, who had become to his enemies a suffocatingly successful figure. Quote, depend upon it that everything for which you fought or which you and I hold valuable in public concerns is in imminent hazard, end quote. Clay wrote to his lifelong friend Francis Brooke on Thursday, December 16th, 1833. By means of the veto, the power as exercised of removal from office, the possession of the public treasury, and the public patronage, the very existence of liberty in the government is, in my judgment, in peril. Oh, that was a quote. Okay. Jackson had won so many battles, crushed so many hopes, frustrated so many competing ambitions that finally Clay believed he had to be stopped or the country was going to collapse. What did you get from that? I read 3 paragraphs in a row to try to make some context to the first paragraph, which is which is the beginning of a new point. I just read it, and I'm trying to think back. Okay, there's some kind of issue about deposits at the bank, and Henry Clay is involved. There's only one paragraph after that before end chapter. Does this sum it up? Let's see. A fevered view, perhaps, but a deeply felt one, and it drove Clay into a frenzied but eloquent assault on Jackson in late December. Quote, I mean myself to open and push a vigorous campaign, end quote. Clay said as he prepared for his coming strike against Jackson on the Senate floor. Clay had failed with the people in 1832, but would not surrender completely to Jackson. Not yet. That was like 4 paragraphs, which were separately spaced. So I'll just show that to you here. See how there's the little space there. So there's these 4 paragraphs are some kind of point that he made about Henry Clay becoming his enemy or something. And then he kind of gets into that, I guess, in the next chapter, which is very, very, very short. A lot of the chapters are very short in this book, I notice. And very short chapters, in my mind now, tend to indicate a poor book. But what was the point of that? You know, what did you learn from that other than that stuff happened? So let's get to the next one. Page 3. Am I being too harsh? Maybe I'm being too harsh. But the whole book reads like this, and you forget about it, and then you find you don't care, and then you have to read it so slowly and carefully just to try to make sense of everything that's going on. That's like, well, why am I reading this? Okay, I had marked down here page 334, first 2 paragraphs. As Emily lay dying, politics in Washington ran their usual course. Well, what is that? In November, people cast their votes for the next president. Oh, is that what he means? It was a close race. And for a while, well, how close was it? And for a while, as the returns trickled in, Van Buren seemed likely to be defeated. Okay, was that a necessary sentence? Could we sum that up a bit easier? If the vote was sent to the House, which was possible, he would probably lose to Harrison or White. Unnecessary drama, because we all know what happened. But by the beginning of December, Van Buren learned that he had won in the Electoral College. Now, I did actually find that interesting because we learn about the results of Electoral College like the day of, late into the night, or if you don't care to stay awake, you just learn about it in the morning, day after, whereas it was in, what did he say here, beginning of December before Van Buren found out he had won. Can you imagine waiting that long? His margin of victory in the popular vote in some states measured in the hundreds. So, okay, so that must be what he meant by close election. Second paragraph. However distracted by his fortunes, President-elect Van Buren comforted Andrew Donaldson with a report that Emily's death had touched even the most cynical in Washington. He would, he said, quote, never cease to admire her excellent character. It will, I am sure, be grateful to your feelings to learn how extensively this sentiment is entertained here, where such feelings are, not apt to take root. It is much more than I have witnessed on any former occasion. No one cares. Okay. And I could choose any paragraph at random, and there's at least one quote, even if it's like a few words in every single paragraph. There's little tiny tidbits of information, but it just reads that way the whole way through, and that's why I hated it so much, because on the one hand, yes, you're getting like little history blurbs here and there, and some things make sense, but it's not, nothing's really explained, and it just didn't seem very logical. Anyway, Let me get to Lincoln's Melancholy before you shut this off in disgust. And let's find out what I feel is better historical writing. In this, I also chose at random. Okay, the first one was very early on. Page 7, first 2 paragraphs. Tell me if this sounds more interesting. In 1998, I came upon a chance reference to Lincoln's Melancholy in a sociologist's essay on suicide. I was intrigued enough to investigate the subject and discovered an exciting moment in the field of Lincoln studies. The aforementioned scholars had built a foundation on which new inquiries could rise. Within a year or so, I had begun to gather together all the basic primary evidence on Lincoln's inner life, intent on studying its meanings and mysteries. It is significant, of course, that I did this work in a time of relative openness on the subjects of depression and mental illness. When Lincoln was 32, he wrote, "I am now the most miserable man living." Ruth Painter Randall found this a ridiculous example of how in Lincoln's time it was, quote, considered quite fashionable to dwell on one's emotions without restraint. Today, more and more people recognize the value of such frank confessions and want to know about the experiences that lay behind them. Okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, okay, that's why he wrote the book, right? That makes sense. And it was very clear. And the quotes made good sense within the context of the paragraph. The next one I here have page 70, second paragraph. Reads here follows. For most of history, people had been made primarily by the circumstances of their birth. Children of farmers had grown up to work the land. Children of the elite had assumed their parents' mantle. But in the early 19th century United States, the political and religious freedoms of the new republic, combined with a new economic reality, allowed young people to construct lives of their own. What had been a dream just a generation before, democracy and government, liberty in speech and religion, became a matter of daily life. The dream still eluded women, Native Americans, and African Americans. Many minority ethnic groups had to struggle for their own. Such shortcomings, though, must not obscure the boldness of the country's basic proposition to say that all men are created equal, even when the phrase in practice applied only to white men, and that they could do what they wished, unfettered by crown or church, was to go further than any nation had gone before. Okay, so, he's just being a historian right there in that paragraph. He's describing, he's explaining things. And I kind of remember that he kind of goes into explaining how Lincoln was a self-made man, and some of Lincoln's life can be made sense in the context of like the whole self-improvement movement kind of began in the 1800s here in America, as we kind of know it today. So let's see here, page 141 I marked down, just another random bit farther in the book. 141, paragraph 1. For a short time, Lincoln had good reason to believe that he would be rewarded for his work with a job he prized above all others, United States Senator from Illinois. Quote, "At that time, it was the height of his ambition to get into the U.S. Senate," said one of his colleagues. Doesn't matter the date and time and who said it. Does it really? Even years later, he said he'd prefer a full term in the Senate to one as president. No surprise in an age when the great orator-statesmen, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun, had served in the upper house of Congress. Senators at the time were not directly elected, but sent to Washington by the state legislatures. To win the seat, then, Lincoln first had to assemble a like-minded majority, and he did. When the Illinois General Assembly convened in January 1855, it had a majority of anti-Nebraska members, many of whom owed their election to Lincoln's work in the fall campaign. The term of James Shields, a Democrat, was up, and he was expected to get the boot. Quote, it was agreed that Mr. Lincoln would succeed General Shields, remembered Elihu Washburn, a congressman from Illinois. I know that he himself expected it. Lincoln lobbied hard for the post. Quote, I have really got it into my head to try to be United States Senator, he wrote to Joseph Gillespie. Quote, and if I could have your support, my chances would be reasonably good. Okay, so there's an example of quotes and timeframes and brief explanations of things, such as how back then a senator was not directly elected, but was elected by the state legislature, and in a reason why somebody would aspire to be a senator even over a president because of great orators, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun. You know, it makes sense. It's good. That's good history to me. Like, that makes sense to me, and the way he wrote it was clear. Nothing was wasted. The quotes did make sense, and in some cases he would add somebody's name, like, oh, okay, Elihu Washburn, a congressman from Illinois, as opposed to just one of his colleagues earlier in a quote where I guess it didn't really matter. I mean, some quotes maybe it matters, some other quotes maybe it doesn't matter. But I felt that his usage of quotes was better. Moving on to my next little blurb. Paragraph 1 of page 203. And this is like a finishing paragraph. I don't know if you can see, it's a finishing paragraph of a section of a chapter. Though he often protested about people who came to see him out of greed, Lincoln said that he appreciated the chance to do kindnesses. Joshua Speed once watched as Lincoln heard from two distressed women, the mother and wife of a man in prison for resisting the draft. When he granted their request, the mother said she would meet Lincoln in heaven. Quote, I am afraid with all my troubles, Lincoln answered. I shall never get there, but if I do, I will find you. That you wish me to get there is the best wish you could make for me. End quote. When the women left, Speed said, Lincoln, with my knowledge of your nervous sensibility, it is a wonder that... Can you imagine saying that to your friend or coworker? You know, with my knowledge of your nervous sensibility... Anyway, with my knowledge of your nervous sensibility, it is a wonder that such scenes as this don't kill you. Lincoln responds, I am very unwell, Lincoln replied. But he said the scene Speed had just witnessed, quote, is the only thing I have done today which has given me any pleasure. That old lady was no counterfeit. Speed, Lincoln added, die when I may, I want it said of me by those who know me best that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought a flower would grow. That's an interesting little story, right? The side story, do you remember the side story from John Meacham here where he was talking about the bonfire lady and being able to shake hands with like the Mexican empress, former empress or something like that? Wasn't there another side? I don't remember. But this is memorable. This is more memorable. Also, isn't it interesting that you could just go to the president in person and try to get someone off of a crime and the president will just pardon them? You know, and interesting. You could just go to him in person and just deal with it right then and there if you could convince him and he felt like doing the right thing. No chance of that at all today, right? That's unheard of. Next thing, going back a few pages, 196. This is after I'd flipped through and then flipped back. I didn't purposely try to get the same kind of section. Paragraph 2, page 196. What do we got here? Modern studies confirm the salutary effect of faith on depression. For example, oh wait, no, that's page 195, sorry. All right. One difference between his ideas and the dominant Christian ones is worth close attention. Lincoln discounted the notion that sin could be wiped out through confession or repentance. Lincoln maintains, said William Herndon, I think that's a historian of Lincoln or a close friend of Lincoln that became his historian, I can't remember, that God could not forgive, that punishment has to follow the sin. This view fitted with both the stern, unforgiving God of Calvinism with which Lincoln had been raised and the mechanistic notion of a universe governed by fixed laws. But unlike the Calvinists who disclaimed any possibility of grace for human beings not chosen for that fate, Lincoln did see a chance of improvement. And unlike some fatalists who renounced any claim to a moral order, Lincoln saw how man's reason could discern purpose even in the movement of a vast machine that grinds and cuts and mashes all who interfere with it. Just as a child learns to pull his hand from a fire when it is hot, people can learn when they are doing something that is not in accord with the wider unseen order. To Lincoln, Herndon explained, suffering was medicinal and educational. In other words, it could be an agent of growth. Interesting. Interesting, right? Right? Wasn't it interesting? Why couldn't we have lessons like that in this? I don't think there are any lessons like that in this book. It doesn't really dive deep into thought and belief and giving you context around those thoughts and those beliefs, whereas this book does. That's the last example I had because I didn't want to inundate you with examples, but the writing was just far superior in this book. I did want to read to you actually some of the sales blurbs here. So under the American Lion book, there's a lot of sales blurbs from historians, and one is from Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is well known for writing Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. I've read that book, and it's worth reading. Her sales blurb for American Lion goes as follows. Every so often, a terrific biography comes along that shines a new light on a familiar figure in American history. So it was with David McCullough's John Adams. So it was with Walter Isaacson's Benjamin Franklin. So it is with John Meacham's Andrew Jackson. A master storyteller, Meacham interweaves the lives of Jackson into the members of his inner circle to create a highly original book. Man, doesn't that sound amazing? Don't you wish that was what the book was? Don't you just kind of wish that? Don't you? You just kind of wish that. I mean, it's got like almost 400 notes in it, you know? That's so many notes. That's a lot of notes, you know? That should make it really, really good. Really good. Ugh. Ridiculous. Anyway, let's read Walter Isaacson's blurb for American Lion. Finally, a book that explains our nation's most enigmatic hero, a man who was revered and reviled and little understood. John Meacham brilliant, takes us inside the family circle that sustained Andrew Jackson's presidency and provided his steadiness of faith. It's a vivid, fascinating human drama, and Meacham shows how the personal was interwoven with the political. Jackson presided over the birth of modern politics, and this book's brew of patriotism and religion and populism tastes very familiar. In helping us understand Jackson, Meacham helps us understand America. Wow. This must be an amazing book. Yeah, I was very, very disappointed with it. Very disappointed. And that's, you know, like rather than dwell on Emily's absence or the price he had just forced Andrew to pay, Jackson turned his attention to politics and policy, noting on arrival at the White House in late September, you know, not early or mid-September, late September. Remember that whole masterful storytelling business. Brilliant. That, quote, business has greatly accumulated in my absence, end quote. Make sure you got a good quote in there, right? he had plenty of time, more than ever before, to devote to whatever awaited him on his desk. You know, amazing. What is what did Walter Isaacson say about Lincoln's Melancholy? Because he's the only other name I noticed that did both. They pay him to do this. Is this what he does for a living? Um, okay, here's Walter Isaacson's quote for Lincoln's Melancholy. Lincoln not only coped with his depression, he harnessed it, explaining how it is critical to understanding both him and human greatness. Schenck does so masterfully and memorably. That's it. Like, that's, yeah. But he's right. That's the book in a nutshell. Amazing. And, you know, only 200 some notes on this one, right? You know, only 200 some notes. But this is actually a fresh look at Lincoln that was very interesting. And just a truly amazing book. Like, if every history book was written as well as this Lincoln's Melancholy, and maybe it's just because of the subject matter, you know, psychology, and Lincoln is very, very, they're just interesting. He's an interesting person with an interesting life just on its own. Maybe that's why it was so good. Maybe just the subject matter itself. You know, I mean, can a really good historian and writer, could Schenck make an equally interesting book about just some random guy from history? Like Andrew Donaldson, Andrew Jackson's son-in-law. Like, could he do that? Right? Could he do that? I don't know. Anyway, both books, highly recommend. Read. You can read it if you want, but you're not going to remember anything. You're not going to gain anything from it. Did I learn anything new? Or I partially wanted to learn in deeper detail the details behind the Trail of Tears that Andrew Jackson did and his fight with the bank. Those are some of the things that I want to learn more about, but I can't tell you about those things because I didn't learn anything from this book. And writing has to be memorable. Okay, good writings, particularly with history, it's got to be memorable because that's what history is supposed to offer: lessons that we remember without studying it to death. Literature kind of leaves emotional impressions on you. Some things you want to memorize, remember, but it's different than, say, a nonfiction like history, which is different from, say, like reading a book about science or a book about like a geography of a country, something like that. History has to be, there has to be memorable things from it, memorable bits and pieces of somebody's life. You know, if you're going to write about a battle, like, why do we need to know about this battle? And don't write like a full book on one battle unless there's a lot of drama and interesting things to insert. Like, I read a book called The Siege of Malta, and that book was absolutely fascinating. Who wrote that? The Siege of Malta. I had gotten it for free on Kindle from that Kindle Unlimited program. Let's see here. I do want to just give you the title of that because the person, because that book was just, the subject matter itself was super interesting. I believe this was it. Ernest Bradford. Is that the one that I read? There's so many. Here, let me just look it up. We've got time. We've got time. We've got time. Nope, that's 2019 books read, Adam. You didn't read it this year. In fact, you didn't even read it last year. You read it in 2017, so let's pull that up. It's a good time for my computer to be slow. 2017, let's use the find feature because that is useful, isn't it? Oh, oops. Malta not found. You're right. I didn't read it in 2017. I must have read it in 2016 or 15, back when I was selling cars. I think Arnold Bradford was the guy. I think he's the guy. Um, Fascinating book, and it's just basically about a battle. That should be it could be made into a movie, like a 3 hour exhaust. Like by the end of it, you're just utterly exhausted by the details of the incredible siege and all the fighting that went on, and how absolutely ridiculous it all sounded. You also learn very interesting things about just that time period, particularly with this is just a random thing, but one thing that stood out to me, a memorable thing, is there was this old man. He's probably in his 70s, I think, and he was captured. He was a knight, and he eventually made his way to Malta and was there for the siege, defending it. I think he was the knight in charge. And he, at one point in his life, in his 70s, as an old man, was captured and on a slave ship and a slave galley. Back then, the people who rowed the galleys were all slaves. They were utterly naked, and they were chained to their row thing, and you rowed for your life. For years, for months, for years, you rowed for your life. Because if you didn't, if you couldn't row anymore, you know what they did to you? They just threw you into the water. They threw you overboard. That's it, done. So, and these guys would be rowing for like 8 hour stretches, 12-hour stretches, like for a very long time. Rowing. That to me is fascinating, that people were actually able to survive that, and even at older ages. So the unbelievable endurance that mankind can go through, particularly when your life is on the line, is just unbelievable. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, and go ahead and read that book, because there's lots of interesting little things like that you learn. And a book like Lincoln's Melancholy, there are lots of interesting things that you learn. Like you learned a few interesting, somewhat memorable things just from a couple random paragraphs. I could find another random paragraph, and you'd probably find something interesting. Here, one last paragraph. Let's see if anything interesting is coming from this. I didn't. This is just completely just taking it random. Though Lincoln's public histrionics did not last, his melancholy did. In June 1841, Mary Todd wrote that Lincoln had been avoiding the gay world for months. The happy world. She wished that he would once more resume his station in society, and, in a reference to the brooding king poet of Shakespeare's Richard II, that Richard should be himself again. In July, Speed wrote to his friend William Butler in Springfield, "Say to Mrs. Butler, I'm glad to hear Lincoln is on the mend," indicating that, last he heard, his friend still had some serious mending to do. In a move that observers described as a kind of convalescence, Lincoln traveled to Louisville in July and August to spend 5 weeks on the Speed estate outside town. Throughout Lincoln's visit, he was moody and hypochondriac. At times very melancholy, Speed said. Speed's mother, no stranger to melancholy, noticed it and tried to comfort Lincoln. Indeed, the empathy Lincoln received from the Speed family is probably unlike anything he had experienced before. He knew the kindness of friends and strangers, but never from quite such a warm, bright, well-read, and close-knit group. Okay, so interesting. Lincoln's first real experience of any kind of humanity came from Joshua Speed's family. Joshua Speed was a friend, I think, that he gained maybe through his lawyering. I can't remember. No, I think he just shacked up with him just to live, just to pay rent in an apartment. But anyway, book is just full of just interesting things that are explained in a logical and memorable manner. The writing is good. John Meacham, one last random paragraph. Questioned afterward by 2 physicians seeking to determine whether he was insane, Lawrence said that he had often attended the tempestuous congressional debates of 33 and 34, 1833 and 34, but denied that the vitriolic exchanges had driven him to the attack. In the end, Lawrence was found to be mad. Hallucination, quote, hallucination of mind was evident, and the wretched victim of a dreadful delusion was afterwards treated as insane and never brought to trial, Benton recalled. Quote, but the circumstances made a deep impression upon the public feeling and irresistibly carried many minds to the belief in a superintending providence, manifested in the extraordinary case of 2 pistols in succession, so well loaded, so coolly handled, and which afterwards fired with such readiness, force, and precision, missing fire, each in its turn, one leveled 8 feet at the president's heart. So I think somebody tried to maybe assassinate the president. Anyway, I'm going to end this video here. You know, decide for yourselves. You know, just read this book and then read this book. Tell me which one is best and why. I try to explain why I thought one was good and one was terrible, and not just terrible, but like I regretted reading it. You know, how many books do you read and you regret it? And I kept thinking, I kept fooling myself, thinking it'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better. I can't wait to get to this section about the Trail of Tears because I bet you I'm going to learn a lot, you know, and no, didn't happen. So I realized this video is actually at the 46-minute mark, and I'm surprised it took that long. I thought this was going to be half that time, but all good things take time, and I'm pleased with this video and how it turned out. Hopefully this will be helpful to somebody out there. Remember to pigeonhole a book before you read it, and just reading some paragraphs like that, you'll kind of get a sense that, you know, does this paragraph make sense really? Do I have to read other paragraphs to make sense of this one paragraph? Are the ideas expressed interesting? Are they written well? Are they understandable? Are the quotes used well, or the quotes seem to just kind of be inserted as filler almost? And you know, I don't know. I guess there are other things you can be looking for, but don't believe the hype. You know, I mean, didn't Walter Isaacson, Doris Kearns Goodwin, didn't they really hype up that book, American Lion? And how did it win the Pulitzer Prize? Like, how did it win that? What criteria does it have to follow? And is the Pulitzer Prize just kind of, is it bullshit? But anyway, I'm going to leave this video off there, and you know, good reading, everyone. Have a fun time reading today, and whenever the next time you pick up a book, pay more attention to the text and find out what it's trying to tell you. All right, bye.